Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State says Western sanctions against Russia will be lifted once the Minsk ceasefire agreement over the crisis in Ukraine is fully implemented.
I reiterated America's view that the Minsk agreements are absolutely, in our judgment, by far the best path, the principal path to peace. And those agreements must be fully implemented. If and when Minsk is fully implemented, it is clear the US and EU sanctions can begin to be rolled back.
John Kerry made the remarks after a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in the Russian resort of Sochi. Kerry also called for serious discussion on a roadmap for holding elections in eastern Ukraine. Both officials referred to differences between Moscow and Washington regarding the issue of Ukraine, but they stressed the need for a peaceful solution to the crisis there. Lavrov also called for the comprehensive implementation of the Minsk agreement. Kerry earlier held talks with President Vladimir Putin in his Sochi residence. The West has slapped several rounds of sanctions against Russia, accusing it of involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Moscow has strongly rejected the allegations as baseless. Well, to discuss this further, let's go to Bristol and talk to Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Welcome, sir. Mr. Gosling, about the Minsk agreement itself, to what extent do you think it has been implemented and respected by both sides?
Well, it's great actually to hear John Kerry saying that he supports the Minsk agreement, in which case maybe he should pull out his hundreds of troops which are in Ukraine, really violating the spirit of that agreement, training Ukrainian troops. Now, one could kind of understand that if Ukraine was part of NATO, but it's not yet, even though it seems that there are many people in the West, at least in the West, not ordinary people, but people who are part of the military and politicians that would like it to be. But look, let's have a look at how the sanctions actually started in the first place, because they happened 2 weeks after the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines MH17 over Ukraine on the pretext that was the responsibility of the Russian rebels. Now, that whole investigation has been kicked into the long grass. We here in Britain have got the black boxes from that aircraft and haven't properly reported what we found on them, and the evidence is starting to point towards the possibility, the strong possibility, that actually the Kiev regime may have been behind that attack. So it may be that these sanctions shouldn't have been imposed in the first place. So, you know, what we've got going on in Ukraine is in fact a horrific type of a situation. Now, look at, ever since the late 1990s, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, there's been very, very difficult for these Eastern European countries to actually be independent. And one by one, the European Union and NATO and the United States have been basically bringing them within their orbit. Now, if I was the Russians, I would be rather concerned about this, particularly as many of these countries are now part of NATO, and yet Russia is being painted somehow as the aggressor. I find this almost impossible to comprehend, although that's what the press here in the West is pushing day after day.
Indeed. And very briefly, in which direction do you think the situation will go if this Minsk agreement fails to hold out?
Well, it's really difficult to say. And one of the positive things to come out of John Kerry's discussions with Vladimir Putin today is both of them seem to be pushing for proper elections. In fact, the second round of elections in the Donbass region. And in fact, probably that would be a good thing to see all over the east of Ukraine. Conducted elections, rather like the ones, hopefully, that we had here in Britain just a few days ago, well overseen. And that will really clarify what is the will of the people in the east of Ukraine and in the west of Ukraine, in various parts of the country, which big power bloc do they want to be with? Now, obviously, most Ukrainians actually would like to be an independent country, but because they're sandwiched between NATO, the EU, and Russia, that's becoming really difficult. So that is actually the most positive thing I think has come out of today, the endorsement by John Kerry of more elections just to get the opinion of the people in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass region. That will hopefully send a very strong message about which side they're on, and hopefully then that will also give a big political edge to stop the fighting. And the Minsk agreement, I think, is going to hold. It looks as if it was a very well put together agreement, and although there is still fighting, it's much less, of course, than it was.
All right, Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Thanks for your thoughts there, sir.